Welcome back. This week, Beyond the Gates enters a dangerous maelstrom where dark deals and emotions collide. As villains quietly piece together, lovers unexpectedly collide, and a secret powerful enough to shatter any mask of power is revealed. The focus of this week's episode is a secret alliance that could reorder the Fairmont Crest Board, a villain group behind closed doors, trading control for terms no one dares to read aloud. In that picture, Leslie offers a honey-sweet but venomous invitation, drawing Haley into a maze of unholy alliances that leaves her torn between survival and sanity. On the other axis of power, Joey and Elon's illicit partnership shakes violently as old recordings, promises, and debts threaten to evaporate, forcing both to choose between exposure or retaliation. And in the private world where love is supposed to be a refuge, Chelsea's good-natured intervention has gone too far, causing a rift in her strong relationship with Madison, turning love into a brutal test of trust. Be prepared, because each next moment could be the spark that ignites the biggest explosion of the season. The week opens in a dense atmosphere, as the silence between the pitched-roof houses and the wrought-iron gates etched with Fairmont Crest's elaborate logo seems to cover the subterranean movements someone would rather not see. Haley steps into the first days with a sensation all too familiar yet still enough to unsettle her breathing. The exhaustion of living with a husband so dauntless he borders on reckless, a man composed enough to stare straight at odd signs at the dinner table, patient enough to try countering with calculated kindness, and keen enough to detect milligram discrepancies in the taste of a glass of wine or the arrangement of prescription pills in a tidy drawer. Bill knows a hand is brushing lightly against his lifeline, and instead of panicking, he chooses to keep the rhythm of life as if everything were under control, forcing the other party to take bigger risks and expose some weakness between those fitful, half-sleepless nights. Haley understands this. That is precisely why a relentless dilemma hounds her, pushing her into days of merciless self-interrogation about motive, about moral boundaries, about her capacity to bear the consequences if the plan is unmasked, about her right to live an ordinary life somewhere without the sound of Bill's car door closing at the same hour each evening, and without those looks of affectionate mockery when he notices the fatigue in her eyes. Everything grows more tangled when she must cross paths with the two shadiest silhouettes in the area. People whose mere names make conversations drop to a whisper and compel security cameras to shift a few degrees off target as if by instinct. Two unplanned encounters, two breaths hovering at the edge of ethics, make Haley realize that all the schemes she thought were private have long been swept into social undercurrents far beyond her control. She quickly grasps that unless she asserts a new position on the board, she will become a faceless pawn in someone else's game. The week's first turn comes as Haley sits across from Leslie in a neutral space, where the objects are arranged with such intention that no one could later recount any detail precisely enough if they were forced to retell it. Leslie lays out a proposition dressed in a flowery name for an all-star lineup, but all the fine words are just lacquer over the bare truth: an alliance. Haley registers the finesse in Leslie's phrasing, conjuring the aura of two powerful women partnering up, while pushing ethical responsibility into a gray zone by weaving in language about safety, community benefit, stability, and assurances no one could ever verify. Haley's confusion doesn't spring from a lack of acuity. It is because she knows Leslie would not make an offer without a foundation, and that foundation must obviously involve the information channels Leslie maintains as a survival habit. While Haley is still parsing the layers of that alliance, she inadvertently opens another door by exchanging a few words with Joey Armstrong, a man straddling interlaced currents of influence few dare underestimate. The encounter unsettles her, not because of Joey himself, but because the name Randy drops in like a cool pinprick, stirring a suspicion as rough as it is dangerous. Joey might believe Randy is having an affair with Haley, or at least consider it a live risk, and that alone would make anyone who fears complications back away from the storm, especially when the storm answers to the name Bill Hamilton. In Joey's eyes, Haley catches a blend that defies easy classification: warning, self-protection, and perhaps a touch of indebtedness toward Bill, the cool-headed, sharp attorney who once helped pull Joey out of legal whirlpools set like snare traps by his rivals. That mixture turns into a thorny equation. If Joey is warning her, the aim is to make her stop. If he is self-protecting, the aim is to guard his distance. If he is helping Bill, the aim is to flush her into the open. In all three scenarios, Haley stands at a disadvantage, and that drives her to the question she can no longer avoid. Should she accelerate the plan to eliminate Bill, shorten her time here, and leave town before the lines have time to change color? But every hurried move makes noise, and noise is the very signal people like Leslie or Joey use to pivot in an instant. Leslie keeps smiling as she speaks of the alliance, yet Haley understands that behind the offer may be a tightly woven net. What does Leslie want from her? Beyond the symbolic weight of a wife confronting an influential attorney, beyond access to slivers of Bill's sensitive information, beyond vulnerabilities Leslie can exploit to keep her on the rails, Haley recalls scattered rumors that Leslie has wrapped up a few affairs with exchanges so clean they left behind no receipt. If the alliance is truly a power strategy, Leslie will never let Haley hold the keys. If it is a subtle trap, Haley could become an unwilling witness, carrying the blame for moves others made from the shadows. There is no easy answer, but the intuition of someone who has lived long in the gray tells her Leslie's invitation arrives at precisely the right moment, aims at the right person, and is laced with latent clauses waiting to be triggered. Randy's presence, the name drifting about like a thin cloud and still chilling the skin, adds weight to every conjecture. If Randy has indeed slipped past his limits, then every trace, messages, photos, phone location pings, lunch receipts, could become raw material for someone to construct a campaign of control. Haley does not yet believe a forbidden relationship exists, but even if it doesn't, a suspicion repeated often enough in a gossip-hungry community can warp the shape of truth. On another branch of the week, Chelsea carries the familiar restlessness of someone who knows the backstage of power, keenly aware that many relationships cannot stand up to public pressure. Madison, her current partner, is a charismatic neurologist who loves to share parts of her life on social media while guarding a private core she won't let anyone touch. Everyone knows Madison was once a fan of Chelsea Hamilton before they became a couple. A detail that seems endearing but can cut both ways, because a feeling born of admiration often changes costumes quickly when it steps into shared life, where the friction between image and person cannot be smoothed over by a few captions. Madison admits she isn't on good terms with her mother. They haven't spoken for quite some time. The mother embraces a modernist creed, living publicly as a statement which only widens the gap, especially since Madison chose a profession bound to scientific discipline and discretion in approaching human data. Chelsea wants to help, partly out of gratitude, partly because she believes easing a family not the right way will steady Madison for a coming project. Good intent swiftly morphs into interference, and interference is seldom welcomed. Least of all when the subject is a mother-daughter bond layered with old misunderstandings. Chelsea steps in, coordinates, makes calls, taps a few media acquaintances, and tries to reopen dialogue by reconstructing a past she thinks is fair. But fairness from a third party is always incomplete, and Chelsea soon realizes she is pressing on a wound that has not yet scabbed. Next week, Madison will learn what Chelsea has done, and that may carve a fresh fracture in what they call trust. The scariest question isn't whether the relationship can survive, but whether Chelsea truly loves Madison with a love that respects freedom and boundaries, or whether she is using love as a restraining embrace to arrange someone else's life according to her own logic. If Chelsea has disturbed a serious secret between Madison and her mother, one heavy enough that the parties chose silence over explanation, forgiveness will not come easily. And if that secret touches an old lab incident, a misdiagnosis, a conditional grant, or a career choice that forced Madison to compromise, Chelsea will face a storm she lacks the moral authority to calm. Across town, where City Hall and the police station share a parking lot, Joey Armstrong reviews the dark seams of a black alliance. Handshakes rushed, agreements sealed by silence. The name Elon Hawthorne, the police chief, rises like a familiar force, still composed even as the status quo tilts. If Joey has to remind Elon who holds initiative, then either Elon has acted beyond guidance or he has traced a new string tying points on the case map together. Public furor over Senator Martin Richardson's scandal has ebbed, but the quiet resembles the surface of a lake after a stone's been thrown. Those final ripples misleading observers about how calm things really are. The dangling question is whether Elon's sharpened interest points toward Doug's death, the tragic accident. A fateful phrase used to replace details that don't sit well. Joey, who can reach into the system, removed Marcel from the security footage the night it happened. At the time, the decision looked like resource protection. Marcel was about to retire and had plenty of reasons to vanish from the news stream. Yet his retirement plans were rolled back at the exact moment you'd expect him to go. Something no one can ignore. Perhaps Marcel saw something he refuses to own. Perhaps he was bought with a promise. Perhaps he is being squeezed by a document that could turn his career to ash. If Elon touches this piece, he will understand that a missing face in the footage is never a technical glitch. It is a message. Once the message is discovered, a switch holder like Joey will be forced to justify it with a story more persuasive than the truth, or accept stepping onto a board where he himself becomes a sacrificial move. Joey does not exactly depend on Bill, but he cannot deny Bill has helped him through whirlpools before. Their relationship forms a fragile symmetry. Respect for capability traded for conditional neutrality. This week, that neutrality is endangered on several fronts. One from Haley, who could tip the balance if she vanishes suddenly after a well-staged medical incident. One from Leslie, adaptable enough to profit politically from any upheaval. One from Elon, who will not hesitate to ask public questions if he feels slighted. And one from Marcel, who stands midway between two paths and thus becomes both sides' weak point. Joey knows a single detail, apparently small, can trigger a domino effect, and he must choose his timing to signal those who need to hear him through the quiet channels they established long ago. All spirals back to Haley as she asks whether to hasten Bill's removal. Shortening a timeline promises relief, but the cost is precision. And in a plan like this, imprecision is a wager of self against luck. Haley weighs every variable. Prescriptions, eating habits, Bill's work schedule, the closed-door meetings she could accidentally walk into, the wide-angle cameras in the kitchen and living room she once ignored, assuming they were only for reassurance. She can already see the fallout if she fails. Anonymously sourced articles, neighbors reminiscing about a couple who seemed happy, experts pontificating about victim and perpetrator psychology, lawyers pointing to gaps in investigative protocol. And she can picture the version called success. A one-way ticket out of town, a short-term rental where no one knows who she used to be, a new phone with no old contacts, a life so tidy it turns dull, where everything is spotless yet oddly soulless. Both are terrifying because between them yawns a moral hollow she cannot fill with self-justification. But when she thinks about the shadowy footsteps drawing near, when she hears someone has asked for grocery receipts from days when Bill abruptly changed his palate, when she sees Leslie waiting patiently for a nod, when she senses Joey's probing in a string of questions that only pretend to be casual, she knows her time is running out. Meanwhile, Chelsea feels something like an alarm bell inside her when word of the intervention reaches Madison. If Madison interprets it as betrayal, Chelsea's entire effort to rebuild the mother-daughter bridge becomes a stain that won't wash out. Chelsea revisits her motives, reminding herself she wanted to repay, to help, to use her personal leverage to neutralize the vicious jibes social media hurls at a woman scientist who dares to live publicly. But love rejects orchestration. If Madison feels turned into her partner's capstone project, the crack will widen. The question is whether Chelsea can step back, respect the boundary line, and let Madison resolve the knot with her complicated mother at her own pace. If not, everything Chelsea intended as care will turn into a tightening cord the loved one must struggle free from. Elon proceeds with the quiet assurance of a seasoned police chief, opening even the tightest doors without fanfare. He rechecks the duty logs from the night Doug died, compares staff bathroom breaks to the moments when frames glitched, brings Marcel into a closed room only to ask a few utterly ordinary questions, the kind that make people feel unsuspected and then, minutes later, slip. Elon reviews Marcel's pre-retirement benefits, the bank transactions with hazy edges, the calls that lasted longer than they should. The more he looks, the more he sees another hand working the strings. If that hand belongs to Joey, Elon will need hard proof. If it belongs to someone not yet revealed, he will need patience. If it is the wordless collaboration of people who don't like each other but need each other, he will have to accept incremental tugs, each pull only a notch at a time. Martin Richardson still moves through public spaces with the air of a man who has weathered the blows, yet anyone watching closely understands a scandal never truly dies. It merely adopts prettier phrases. The lull in public anger is only a pause for opponents to gather strength. A new, clean proclamation may be drafted, but political stains live on in collective memory. Martin needs someone like Bill to keep a sturdy legal perimeter, and that makes every tremor around Bill's family a top concern. If Bill suffers an incident, those he once protected will flounder, and floundering is when old documents are hauled out, past calls decoded, and harmless associations take on meaning. Thus, Haley's story is no longer private. It plugs directly into the power structure of the whole community. On the week's final night, Haley stands before the bathroom mirror, watching the dark rings under her eyes bleed outward like ink in running water. Her future looks like a freshly paved road already laced with hairline cracks forecasting the coming rains. She recalls those early afternoons at Fairmont Crest when she believed neatness could shield against chaos. Now she recognizes that neatness is only a better disguise for chaos. He thinks of Leslie, of the possibility that together they could weave a new curtain over movements they cannot stop, of Joey, of eyes that conceal only half the story, of Randy, an external variable capable of ruining the equation, of Bill, the gravitational center pulling everyone into orbit. She thinks of Chelsea and Madison, of how love can bend ethics in the name of protection, of Elon and Marcel, of the erased footage and the postponed retirement, of Doug, a cold night, the length of a brake screech just long enough for a change of heart but too short for a life to turn around, of Martin, of speeches that promise healing, of unity summons that function like analgesics. She finally understands that every answer is costly, and the only free thing is the illusion of safety. Fear does not paralyze her. On the contrary, it forces her to streamline every step. She rearranges the glass jars, swaps the positions of two pillboxes, and notes the seemingly petty things. The time Bill tends to gaze out the window, the shoes he changes into at day's end, the way he leaves his phone resting halfway on the table. She double-checks her calendar, then scans the milestones others have imposed on hers. The appointments Leslie intentionally overlaps with Elon's meetings, the messages Joey sends without wanting a reply, the calls Chelsea misses while busy managing Madison's narrative. She names them silently, not to remember, but to prepare to cut them away. And when she steps out of the room and unlatches the window to let the air in, she knows the week will flow in the direction she sets, if she can muster the courage to pay the price. Because every alliance has a cost. Every deliverance comes with conditions. Every secret demands a grave, and every name etched on Fairmont Crest's honor roll hides diary pages no one should read. Haley walks down the dim hallway, hears the far-off ignition of someone's car, and understands that the line between agent and victim is only a chalk mark, ready to be blown away by the first seasonal wind. Across town, the other players are preparing their own moves, each convinced that just a bit more cleverness will let them command the board. But the truth is that no one controls everything, and those who think they do often fall the farthest when the mask of stability slips. The new week will grant no favors. It will merely deliver the consequences each person has been quietly planting for a very long time. And for Haley, those consequences will not only define who she is, but also define those watching her through the fogged lens of power and fear.